Hi everyone, my name is Roger Naum. I'm professor of Hebrew Bible at Candler School of Theology. Yeah, my path to becoming a Candler professor is not really traditional. I majored in economics as an undergraduate, but the church was always an important part of my life. As a child, I went to the Korean United Methodist Church of Santa Clara, and back at the time, in the early 70s, the Korean church was not just a place of worship. It was the only time where my family got to interact with many other Korean people and speak the Korean language freely, eat Korean food, and worship was also in the Korean language. And so church was always really critical to our family's values and our upbringing. And so during college, I decided I wanted to become a pastor. And so I stayed at school, I finished my econ degree. As soon as I graduated, I moved to Seoul, Korea. And there I attended seminary, I got my master's of divinity. During that time, I worked at a church of 30,000 people as a pastoral intern. And when I graduated, I didn't feel it was the right time for me to be a pastor. So I ended up coming back to the United States. What did I do? I had an econ degree. So I got a job in finance in the Silicon Valley, and I worked there for 4 years as a financial analyst. And in the 90s, it was a really great time for semiconductors, as you might remember. The Pentium chip by Intel had come out, and the company was doing really well, and I got married, and my wife and I were shopping for a house in the Silicon Valley in our 20s, which was a pretty big economic accomplishment. And at the time, though, I was enjoying my job to a degree, but it certainly wasn't filling me. And my wife could tell that. And in the middle of house shopping, she asked me this question: if you can be guaranteed success in anything, what would you choose? And I looked at her and I said, well, you know, I think I would have probably wanted to be a Bible scholar. I think I would have been pretty good at that. And she responded, well, why don't you do that? And I was like, okay. And so I actually quit my job and pursued this full-time, entered a PhD program. And I got my first job at a small West Coast Oregon university. I worked there for 12 years. And the Candler opportunity came up 4 years ago, and it was just too good to pass up. The school, its values, its mission, the colleagues and the students, and I happily moved and accepted the position. That was 4 years ago, and I'm delighted to be at Candler today. I gravitate towards the study of migrations, I think largely because I come from an immigrant family, and my family had to navigate through certain things that are very indelible in my mind. And so in the ancient world, there were always migrations, and these were accelerated with the rise of empires. And one thing that happened is empires would conquer lands, and they would brag about deporting peoples. It's kind of a really weird flex from a humanitarian perspective, but this is what ancient inscriptions do. They brag, and they want to legitimize their political authority. And so in the ancient world, we have all these great sources of evidence besides these royal inscriptions. We have archaeology. We could see when a culture enters a certain region through things like pottery style. We have economic documents where we have names, and we can put all these things together. We actually have a pretty good idea of how a lot of these migrant communities lived. We understand their labor. We understand the way they thought about kinship and burials. We see actually court cases of siblings suing each other for their father's land. We have marriages when sometimes people would marry outside a certain ethnic group for perhaps economic purposes. And we put these all together and we learn that migrations are very complex, and they reflect a human experience that's very nuanced. And so we tend to categorize religion and economics, but these are all integrated with how people forge identity in these migrations. And one of the things we could take away from for today is that when we look at migrations as part of a political agenda, when we dehumanize the people that undergo these experiences, we really do a disservice to humanity. Migrations have all sorts of reasons and motivations. They have all sorts of outcomes, and they're dynamic. And it's so complex how you forge your identity within migration. For example, consider Asian Americans. They come at different stages in whether you came as an adult or as a child or born into the second and third generation. That's going to have impact on your identity, your economic opportunity, your religious affiliation, your ambition. And so those nuances, I think, are really crucial for us to understand in these migrant communities. had the opportunity to begin a new class, the Bible in Asian America. And it is a class in which we try to look at real Asian American experiences. Through history, through culture, we might look at Japanese American internment of the 1940s. We might look at the present day and the phenomenon of K-pop and BTS, or even something like the surge in anti-Asian racism happening as a result of COVID-19. We look at those tropes and ideas and themes of the Asian American experience, like identity formation, like assimilation, hybridity, how as Asian Americans, those two components of your identity sometimes reach a tension, even contradiction in who you are. And we take those experiences and those thoughts and those themes, and then we use it as a lens to the biblical text. So when you read the Bible, you'll notice that many people also, major characters in the Bible, have these hybrid identities. For example, you could think of Joseph, who was a son of Jacob and an Israelite, but lived in Egypt and got to some power and strength within Egypt. You could think about Ruth, who was a Moabite and a widow, but found her way in Judah among the Judean people. You could think about someone like Esther, who was also Judean, but uplifted to a place of power within the Persian court. And this identity was also intersectional because she's gendered as female. And as a female, that plays a great role in your interpretation in the book of Esther. You look at the book of Nehemiah and you see this incredible generational divide between first and second generation immigrants or repatriates that come back to Judah. You have arguments, you have interfighting. You actually have in Nehemiah 13 this concern because the second generation is not speaking the home language of Hebrew. And the first generation is really frustrated with it. That is the most Asian American thing ever of language conflict within generations. And so what we hope to do in the class is have these Asian American lenses on our biblical readings to reflect on the Bible in new and innovative ways, and then perhaps come back to our Asian American experience to help us reflect on our own lived reality today. One example is we talk a little bit about the phenomenon of the model minority. Emory students tend to be pretty ambitious, pretty talented, good writers, and so we look at a text like Daniel, who's a foreigner who's elevated within the foreign court. And then we think about how does the model minority apply to Daniel in terms of the expectations of how he's supposed to live, how he's supposed to submit to the Persian Empire, and how he rebels and the consequences of those types of rebellions. And then that story gives us another opportunity to reflect on our own lives as Asian Americans. And I asked this real question in class. How have you benefited from the model minority phenomenon? And how is that discrediting Asians, in fact, all other non-white races in the American cultural system? And so these become powerful conversations for us to both reflect in the Bible in new ways and also reflect on our own lives. One of the joys of being at Candler is the opportunity to walk alongside students and to mentor them in their formation. And so at Candler, we have multiple goals. Of course, we have an academic goal for our students. In my particular area of biblical studies, we want them to learn the languages of Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. We want them to understand historical context. We want them to understand different literary theories on how they can interpret the Bible. But seminary education is not just cognitive formation. It's not just learning stuff, but there's an aspect of character growth. Our goal and mission of the institution is to develop leaders for the church. And that means we want to develop leaders with integrity, with a moral compass, with ethics, with an idealized version of who they can be and how they can influence both the church and the world. And in that sense, I not only get to teach them about Hebrew verbs, but walk alongside them as they grow and mature in both their faith and their character, as they submit themselves to experiences that form those paths of their being. A third part I would add is just as an Asian American, I often feel a special affinity to our Asian American students. I think I have a place of empathy. I could understand certain concerns and experiences. I don't want to declare that we are essentialized, that all of our experiences are the same, but there are certain, for example, stereotypes that we all face as embodied Asian Americans that perhaps we need to think through and talk through. And so that's part of what I can bring to the students of Asian descent at Candler. Diversity has become ammunition in cultural wars today and a target and associated with some sort of progressive agenda. And I think diversity is tremendously important, but don't listen to me. I would point you to peer-reviewed research on diversity, for example, in the field of business. It is well documented in research that having diverse leadership in business leads to greater profits. And it makes sense. You don't want people with the same point of view, the same assumptions, the same particular values to make these really important decisions for businesses. And when you have a diverse team, you're able to catalyze a greater imagination for how you can lead a company, how you can be strategic and foresight into the coming business cycles. I think the same is true in the humanities, and I could speak to biblical studies. So much of biblical studies scholarship is a very particular way of trying to extract a certain interpretation from a text that tends to be European-centered. All the big fancy universities like Harvard and Yale and Duke and Emory tend to lean on these types of interpretations until very recently. Well, I could speak to myself as an Asian American scholar, as someone who grew up in an immigrant home. When I look at a text, for example, Ezra Nehemiah, I see in the text a migration document. It says that in the very opening verses of Ezra 1. And because you have this group of Judeans moving after 2 generations back to Judah after being in exile. And I have the argument in Ezra Nehemiah that it is really a migration document, and that everything that you see within the text, their struggles for power, their struggles against their neighbor, their struggles on how to conduct worship, their struggles with falling away from God, I think that needs to be interpreted in a frame of migration and what different migrants struggle with. And so I think that's a way that my own personal experience can impart into the text and its interpretive history something somewhat new and maybe fresh and innovative that hasn't been seen before. And you could think about how that can be even multiplied with these really important themes in the Bible, like kinship or land. And you can consider biblical interpreters throughout Asia or Africa or Latin America that have different notions of what kinship means. You know, a lot of these families, the whole idea of what do you want to do when you grow up, that's not even a question. You do what your father tells you to do. And the whole idea of what am I going to major in and what am I going to do, that's a very recent American phenomenon. And when you expand the cultural lens, it comes up to more innovative, richer, nuanced interpretations of biblical texts. I am actually very hopeful for the future, and I'm very hopeful for the future of the church. And a lot of this is because every day I get to interact with students at Candler. And I see these students as being tremendously talented in so many ways. Many of them are first-generation college students, and here they're getting a graduate degree at Emory. Many of them have been so resilient and have overcome so much in coming to Candler. And many of them have these great talents intellectually, all this raw intelligence, this ability to think critically, ability to ask questions, ability to take training and to take mentorship and to refine themselves. And it's not just their intellectual abilities that I admire. I admire a lot of their motivations for coming to Candler. They want to change the world. They have a vision for the church that is very different from the church that I grew up with. They want to integrate issues of social justice, poverty, address racism and climate change within their faith context. And they have a vision for the church to do the same thing. And when I see this every day, time and time, from these wonderful students, it gives me great hope for the future of the church.